the title of this paper is Yield Gaps of Lucerne in Livestock Systems of Argentina. It changed a little bit from the original version. Well, essentially the work, the paper came out thanks to all my co-authors. I couldn't have done it without them because honestly, and your name is missing here, Derrick. That's not good.
Well, just add it in. There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
I'll take credit.
I don't know what happened. I just pasted it and it didn't go, but yeah. So yeah, essentially it was a very long journey. So it's always nice to know a bit of how it started. But it started back in 2016 while I was doing the scholarship in New Zealand, working under Derrick's supervision, and he told me that I should write a few papers to pass the classes, and those papers were really the basis of the work that came after. So, and the topics were very, I mean, he gave me the opportunity of choosing the topics, and I wanted to know more about lucerne. So I did a couple of lucerne grazing, also potential milk yield of lucerne-based dairying, factors that affected the canopy development. So I learned a lot about phyllochron and phenology of the crop. I also worked on the field in Hunk's experiments. I also shared a bit of time with Shumei at the end of my stay there. But essentially all that work, finally, I was able to produce something out of that. And this was sort of the first attempt, which we did with Jonathan at the World Alfalfa Congress, which Derrick probably remembers because there was no physiology at all in the whole Congress. But it was an interesting experience, and we were able to present this data, which essentially I took the idea from a paper on Kikuyu, which is written by well, a colleague, an Argentinian colleague. Well, the name is going to come to me eventually. So he did it on Kikuyu, and I thought this is interesting, an interesting approach to know where the production losses are and where the utilization losses are. And I did that for lucerne. We found a couple of published data. This was quite striking. This was the annual yield, world record lucerne yield for Arizona. But it was published by Ludwig, and then we did that and started analyzing, well, what's going on? Why are we getting here in Argentina for irrigated? This is for dryland, and this is the average yield measured in grazing trials, the utilized in this trial, and the average, which we started seeing for commercial dairy farms. And so eventually, after many versions and many years after, imagine this took us at least 5 years, 3 of working on a draft, we came out with this paper. So that's sort of the introduction. This is a typical picture of what a dairy or a beef farm looks like in Argentina. Most of our dairy cows are grazing lucerne year-round. We have the climate. We have the conditions. We have a very temperate and temperate warm climate. We are sort of where I live right now. It's sort of in the subtropical area, but it gets very hot in the summer, but that's not too bad for lucerne. The problem would be with potential evapotranspiration, which is really high. But this is a typical image, and this is where lucerne is located in Argentina. So this is the total lucerne area, and we have about 1.5 million hectares in total. Now, about 500,000 of those hectares are in mixtures, which are mostly located in the province of Buenos Aires. Those mixtures are lucerne combined with grasses, essentially with grasses. And then there's the pure lucerne, which the main province is this one in the center, right in the center of Argentina, which is Cordoba. But we also have a lot of lucerne in Santa Fe, where I live, particularly in the central area, and also all the other provinces. But essentially, 3 provinces are the ones that concentrate most of the lucerne area in Argentina. That's important because then we're going to use data from those sites to actually start doing this yield gap analysis. Now, the issue is that over the last 2 decades, when you check the data from national statistics, which are somewhat loose, they're not very accurate, but the statistics are showing that we went from about 5 million hectares about 25 years ago to about 1.5 million hectares today. And 10 years ago, we were around 3 million. So the area sown with lucerne is going down. The reason for that is that all these dairy farms and these systems are intensifying their rotation. So we get a 3-year lucerne with a lucerne stand that lasts 3 to 4 years maximum for dairy farms. And then the farmer goes into 2 or 3 years of annual crops, which are destined for silage. And so this is what a typical diet looks like for dairy cows. And the reason why I'm showing so much dairy, and the paper talks about livestock, of course includes beef, but there's not too much data on beef, about the diet of the beef. I mean, we know that about 90% of what beef eats, beef cows, is forage, but we don't know much about that forage. We know it's natural pastures and a bit of also sown pastures. So the most detailed data comes from dairy. So we have about 29% of the diet, the average diet of the dairy cow is concentrates. Then we have about 25%, which is silage. And this 20 years ago, this was about 10 to 15%. So it's growing. And the rest, 46%, is this is fresh forage, which is whatever kind of forage. It could be temperate pastures. It could be also annual grasses, and also hay. Now, if you look at this graph, you guys from New Zealand, this is probably what a system 5 looks like for New Zealand. This would be probably the most intensified dairy in terms of the use of concentrates. This is the average for Argentina, and we see that this trend is increasing. We have more and more concentrates being imported and silage being used, and less forage being consumed in terms of grazed pastures and hay. And the other problem, because this by itself would not be a big issue if we were able to actually eat a lot of grass per hectare. Now, the problem is that we're not eating enough. We're eating very little, and this is a trend showing how this is going down. So we see that from 2001, there's been a decay in terms of the total consumed pasture. This is essentially dairy farms. So we could assume this is mostly lucerne, although there might be other pastures mixed up in here, but this is a decline we're seeing. And then after 2011, 2012, there was a switch in terms of the relative grain prices, and prices went up. So we had a change in that trend. But again, we're not eating too much pasture. When you compare this to New Zealand is about 10 tons per hectare. Australia is about 7.5. Ireland is about 8. So we are really on the lower end of those countries. And there's no reason for this to happen. There's no climate. Our climate is different, of course, but there's a very good climate for lucerne. There's precipitation, enough precipitation, a lot of radiation, good temperature. So this shouldn't be happening. And so that's another one of the reasons why we did this paper, is to start to understand why is this all happening. This was not, of course, the main goal, but the main aim of this was to understand the drivers which were underlying the lucerne yield and the yield gaps, but also to identify the environmental and management practices that could increase this consumption of lucerne. Because in the end, what we want is to increase the lucerne consumption before even the increase in the yield. There's no point in increasing yield if we're not going to eat it, right? So that was sort of the logic behind the paper and the main aim of this paper. So to talk a bit about the methods, this is what happened. The The measured yields were obtained from this network. This is the title of the publication. This publication usually comes out every year or every 2 years. I'm not really sure. Essentially, this is what comes out. This is a very large network of Argentina. It has comparative trials of Lucerne genotypes. And what they do is they measure above ground biomass, undercutting. All these experiments are undercutting. There's no grazing. And they are all cut at 10% flowering, or when the crown sprouts reach 5 centimeters, which is, of course, again, it's a bit of a compromise. We would have liked to see this being cut or grazed earlier, but it is a very solid data set, and it spans from a very, very long period of time. So it allows us to do a lot of work, because there's a lot of data which is inside this this network. And the data, of course, are grouped into semi-dormant cultivars and winter active. So semi-dormant is 5, 6, and 7, and winter active is FD8, 9, and 10 genotypes. What we did in this work is we used the 3-year average yields from winter active cultivars only. We took the winter actives. That was sort of a discussion whether we should include the winter dormant or the semi-dormant cultivars. But in the end, because there's some noise with those winter dormant, because perhaps they should be cut at different timetables. You know, there was some discussion with this. So eventually we ended up with the winter active. And also another big thing was that we only used the 90th percentile for yield. And this was another big issue, because we didn't want to use older cultivars or genotypes, which of course would have perhaps made some noise in this simulation. And so we had 22 years of data spanning from 1994 to 2016 and 11 sowings, because these experiments are sown every 2 years. And we took these 12 sites from Argentina. 9 were rain fit and 3 were irrigated. So what you see here, the crosses are irrigated sites. The rest is all rain fit experiments. And then we'll come to this results. And the model we used to estimate the potential yield is a model that originally developed by McCollum Bishop Hurley, but then Herman did a calibration for Lucerne in Argentina, which was also published. And this is what the site, you can also access this site and set up your own data, and just you need a couple of inputs, like the hemisphere you're at, the latitude, the type of soil, the amount of water available, the fertility conditions, the cover of the crops, and then you can, with the average minimum, average maximum, and the accumulated rain, you can actually simulate what the growth of that crop is going to look like. So essentially that's what it does, and those are the input data, and it just estimates this above ground plant growth from the product of radiation use efficiency and intercepted PAR, which is of course related to the actual amount of green herbage mass present in the crop canopy, and then we'll deal with that a bit later. And also soil water factor is calculated daily to estimate the rate of biomass growth in relation to a standard soil water balance and evapotranspiration. So you do have a very it's not very detailed. The soil type is just telling you whether that soil is very shallow or it's deeper, and that's what it does. So for each site, this is what the Excel sheet looks like, and this is part of the simulations that we run. So for each site, a 30-year simulation was run to determine that potential yield under both rain-fed and irrigated conditions. And we assumed that there were no other limitation other than the water holding capacity. Okay, this is a limitation of the paper itself, but it's what we did. The harvest management was also set to cut pasture biomass the last day of each month, and the residual green pasture biomass was set at 0.5 tons per hectare to prevent the lag phase, which we discussed previously during these days of the workshop. And so we obtained the long-term annual herbage accumulation, and this is the formula we used for the yield gap. So the potential yield minus the observed yield, which was the yields from the National Lucerne Evaluation Network, and divided by the potential yield times 100, and that's what gave us the gap, the percentage of that gap. So some of the results we got here is the measured yields range from 7 to 10 in soils with limited water holding capacity or in places where it was very, very dry. So for Argentina, as you move to the west, there's a decrease in precipitation. And there's also, for this area right here, there's also an increase in the potential evapotranspiration. You have very high radiation and very low precipitation. So it was obvious that that would happen. But then we had up to 27 tons of dry matter per hectare under irrigation or in deep soils under rain-fed conditions, such as this one. This one was deep soil, and this was under rain-fed. This is Marcos Juárez. It's a site. It's an interesting site, and then we'll go there again because it's interesting enough to mention it later. But so this is the potential yield under rain-fed conditions. Again, this was the measured yield, and this is potential. This is what we simulated with the model from Herman. So as you can see, the potential yield, again, where there's no irrigation and there's very little precipitation, the potential yield under rain-fed conditions, of course, is going to be low. This was expected. But then many other sites, and particularly all the central area, this is the main dairying area of Argentina, all this area right here, the central area of Santa Fe and Cordoba. So yields there would be above 20 tons per hectare per year, which is very, very high compared to the observed yield and compared to on-farm yields, which are even lower. The potential yield under irrigation were, well, much higher. In this case, we were able to reach up to 37 to 38 tons per hectare. And these sites are the sites which I say they are very arid. There's very little precipitation, very high radiation, long days, sunny days. So this would be expected as well. But as you can see, there's a very big difference between rain-fed and irrigated conditions. So potential yields, as you can tell from the previous slide, was ranged from 25 to 39 tons. As latitude increased, the rain-fed locations had lower yields due to, well, lower precipitation. As you can see here, when you go to higher latitudes, the rainfall drops. So that's essentially, that was one of the main reasons. There could be others, temperature, frosts, whatever, but the main one would be lower precipitation. And this is what rain-fed simulator yields under irrigation and under rain-fed conditions. As you move further from the sites where there's no irrigation here and the latitude is very low, there's very little precipitation, the gap is, of course, much, much higher between the irrigated and the rain-fed conditions. And that doesn't seem to happen so much when you go to lower latitudes where there's more precipitation. Also, the yield gaps went from negative values to about 60%. And this is something interesting to discuss. This is the location I was mentioning before. This is Marcos Juárez. And the yield gap there was the most negative value was found there. We believe the reason for that, the yields in Marcos Juárez are just out of the map usually. They're very, very high. And there's evidence that there's a water table there. They are very, very, very good soils for lucerne, not very, they're very deep. They don't have any limitations in terms of lots of clay or lots of silt. So they're very good soils, and it appears to be that the water table is doing some contribution there, and thus the reason for this negative yield gap, which was of course unexpected, but we were able to explain it because of that. And then the yield gap was higher for rain-fed than for irrigated conditions. So rain-fed sites had a higher potential of increase compared to those that were irrigated, which of course were not many. The irrigated were just 3 and the other ones were 9.
Just to, yes, before you go, you used rainfall because you couldn't do soil water budgets, or you assumed the soils were quite consistent across the region? I know Rogerio has been setting up soils for us to look at what might happen from a soil water budget perspective.
Yeah, well, we did use the data from the soils of each location, but the model, Herman's model, you know, we were.
Sorry.
Herman, yeah, go ahead.
We used it the model has not a soil fertility tool, but it had only a water capacity. You can change the yes water. Yes, this was taken into account.
Okay.
Water.
Yes. The water holding capacity of the soil. Yeah.
So you had some water. You had some soils data that you could use. That okay?
Yes,
I just wanted to clarify that point.
Yeah,
I thought you had, but you had
water table. The input of water table is not taken into account, and here in the number 7 point, water table is an important source for.
But in the others, you had the soils associated with the site.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Well, we found that the water availability was the main driver of the yield gap. So whenever we added irrigation, the gap, you know, the potential to increase yield was higher when we added this irrigation. And if you check this map, I'm going to try to zoom in because it's very little. That's as far as I can go. But if you check this map and you check the locations, all this area here where we had data points, also here, they are having this P minus, this is PET, not ETP, but it's in Spanish. So it's very, very low. You have deficits up to 300, 400 millimeters per year. And so potentially that would explain during the summer, you have these deficits, and those deficits, when they occur, you have very high temperatures. If you could actually irrigate during those times, the potential for yield increase would be very, very large. So that would be explaining, or it would be one of the reasons why, well, irrigation would be such a useful tool. Now, of course, as Herman was pointing out, we didn't have any other soil module other than the water holding capacity. So we didn't have soil pH or soil nutrients. Or this was a simple model, and the objective was a different one. But if you analyzed soil pH and you contrast this with the yield gaps that we found, when you check this data, you will see that many of the sites are in areas where the soil pH is below 6. So we have 5.5 to 6 in these areas. So it is expected that soil pH would be, at least it would be affecting this yield potential in these sites, because as we all know, well, not only does it affect nodulation, but it also affects the availability of other nutrients, particularly phosphorus. And coming into that, when you check other soil parameters, this is data from 165 dairy farms in the same region, mostly in that central region of Argentina. So when we checked this was done about 7 years ago. I'm sure this has not changed very much, because unfortunately dairy farmers are not very prone to fertilizing. So soil pH was below 6.5 in 53% of the samples, and then above 7.2, which is okay, in 8%, and between 6.5 and 7.2, which would be optimum in 40% of the samples, for 39. And so all this data, what is showing us is there are other parameters that could be affecting, which were not considered in the study, but were discussed. We thought it was important to bring them on and discuss them in the paper, well, to acknowledge that there are other things that are probably very, very important when seeing these gaps. And the other one was the utilization gaps, which unfortunately we couldn't model this in any way, or we couldn't think of a way of modeling, but we did have some experimental data. And this is what a paddock usually looks like for beef cows, and this is what Herman was showing yesterday. you know, I always say this is very, very good for honey farmers. You call them honey farmers now? Well, but to make honey, this is great. But to actually produce beef, this is not good. And this is what you end up with: 40% grazing efficiency during spring, and it goes up during winter because there's very little availability of forage availability, which is exactly the same as what Herman was showing yesterday. When you have very, very high availability of forage, you enter the paddocks when there's 3.5 tons, the grazing efficiency drops dramatically. When you enter it when it's 2 tons, then grazing efficiency goes up. And this is linked essentially to 2 or 3 things. Low stocking rates, overall farm stocking rates are usually low, although they're going up, but they're lower than other countries. And then there's this long grazing intervals, which in fact what this means, it's not the long grazing interval, but rather entering the paddocks with very high levels of biomass. So when you enter the paddock too late, you end up with this. This is what it looks like. And this is beef cows. And I always say that beef cows, they are more forgiving than dairy cows. Dairy cows are not going to forgive you. I'll show you a slide after this one, which is showing exactly that.
I just want to make a couple of comments at this point, because I'm looking at Laura, who's on screen here, and her mouth dropping open when she's seeing beef cattle eating lucerne like that, because in New Zealand we struggle to get people to think about putting beef cattle on lucerne. I don't have any issue with it, but you know, there's huge potential for us to do it and we don't do it.
You just need bloat oil in the trough.
Yeah, so that was my question: is what are your animal health issues associated with monocultures of lucerne being grazed like this?
Well, I'm consulting 2 or 3 beef farms, and when they start grazing too late, there's actually about a similar amount of a number of issues than when they start early. When you see that paddock as before, and you see the behavior of these beef cows, these are actually beef heifers or steers probably. What they do is they enter the paddock and they eat the top part, and then they eat the regrowth from the crown, and they leave all the rest is left behind. And that is the bomb. When they're eating that, that's the grenade. You know, that's what's going to create bloat. So bloat is actually seen the first hour or 2 hours when they're entering the new paddock, when they are doing this, you know, when they're entering like this. When they enter the paddocks, like Herman was showing, there could be issues as well, but the probability is actually lower because you make smaller paddocks, you have a very high control over the animals, and they eat the whole plant. So there's less, so there's less risk of bloat.
Excellent answer. And as I said yesterday, science is repeatable. We have exactly the same issue. So what a cow does is wrap its tongue around that stem and strip the leaves off. And so when they've got a hard stem like this, they can strip the leaves off quite easily, and they get that really high quality bloat risk material. But when it's shorter and that stem is soft, as they do that, the stem actually comes away with it. So they're increasing the fiber and the intake. From what I can see, I have no data for this, but that's my anecdotal explanation for why this can be as risky as, you know, the 25, 30 centimetre that we're talking about. And it's partly why with our ewes and lambs, when it's really lush in the spring, we actually mow some strips in the paddocks before they enter, because once again, they can't then strip the leaf off, and they do get some of that stem, which is increasing their fibre intake. So, you know, I think it comes down to management. You know, we can do management ways to deal with this. Yeah, carry on. I interrupted, but thank you.
No, it's a good point, because that is what any farmer in Argentina, even in Argentina, that's the main issue they're going to raise. What do you do with bloat? I always show your slide, Derek, when you're just saying they ask you, when do you enter the paddocks? And you did this in Argentina, and it was sort of a scandal. You know, everyone was like, what do you do? You're crazy? Well, so I always show that, and the first thing the farmer does is say, what about bloat? And then there's, of course, Laura, there are other things that you can do. There's you can mow in front of the cows and leave the pasture to actually dry a little bit for a couple of hours, and then you graze it, and that also reduces the risk. There's well, several things you can do, but you usually expect the same percentage of death, which is about 3%, when you manage it properly compared to when you manage it improperly. So with this, you have 3.5% death, and grazing it earlier, you have about 3.5%. If you do things right, of course. And it also requires training. If the farmer is new, the guy that's managing the animals. Same thing for dairy. This is a dairy farmer from Argentina, and he was showing us this paddock. And this guy is the guy who works with me. I'm 165 and he's 195. So it's very unfair they do that, but that's who they put me to work with. So this guy, Osvaldo, was showing us the paddock, and he's a veterinarian. He was very happy with this lucerne, which is, well, 40, 50, 60 centimeters. And we were just telling him, well, did you look on the other side what they're leaving behind? What are those dairy cows leaving behind? And dairy cows, as I said, they're not so forgiving because they know they're going to get supplements. So why would they eat that stem? They don't have to. They just have to wait a little longer. And so this is what you end up with. You know, you end up with the higher portion has leaves, the lower portion has no leaves. And what I usually tell my students, you know, if you feeding them those hard stems is just like feeding them newspapers. So no quality and no milk or beef produced with that. This is also another experiment, but similarly, the early grazing treatments about 2 tons per hectare, and the late grazing treatments about 3 tons per hectare. And this is the experiment that you saw, Derrick, when you were in Pergamino. This is what we did, and we accomplished about 74% grazing efficiency and about 50% when they entered late grazing. So to end, so concluding remarks, Argentinian livestock systems, and I believe any system that is, you know, facing the commodity prices and is exporting commodities, they need high amounts of harvested pastures to be profitable, and particularly to be resilient. When we see all these prices go up, now farmers are going crazy. You know, the ton of soybean is going above $600. And this is a moment when they start going crazy and they say, we need more grass. Well, the problem is they never pay attention to the grass. They never pay attention to lucerne. So it's very important that we do this. You know, we start putting the focus onto getting more lucerne grown. Irrigation was responsible for a 53% gap in lucerne yield for rain-fed sites, but there was also potential to increase yields by 22% under rain-fed conditions, and this was probably linked to all this other data that we discussed about fertilization, pH, sulfur, phosphorus. A lot of those things probably make up for that gap. And also enhancing current grazing management practices could more than double the amount of grazed pasture per hectare. And this I would say could, I would just say can, because Herman just proved it, and there's very, very solid data from Argentina, and it's published. So I would just go and say can double. And well, then we do have other things that we haven't discussed, but we did have a paper published with imperfectly drained soils where lucerne persistence usually goes down, soil acidification, those low use of fertilizer, low stocking rates, and high pre-grazing biomass levels. All those factors were identified as major constraints to lucerne production and utilization. that's what I had for you guys today. I hope you all understood what I said. I was a bit nervous to be talking back in English, doing a presentation in English. It's been a while.
Laura, yeah, I think people understood no problem at all, Jose. So
Great.
I think it was really a useful way to conclude our workshop. We've started from the very theoretical modelling, and we end up saying actually it's the practical on farm that really matters. And I think that's the space that we all operate in, is trying to understand the science, but have it actually adopted on farm is the key thing. And I think if we think back over the week, you know, the phenology stuff that Shumei presented at the beginning, showing us that leaf appearance is the same, and then it changes when we flower, and then our management says, you know, this flowering thing of 10% is just ridiculous. But if we're grazing, it just doesn't work. It's just not necessary. So there's a small band of us that believe it now. It was a band of one for a while, but there's a few more people now.
It's growing larger, Derek. Yeah, it's growing larger.
It's not quite exponentially yet, but
no, but it will get there. Yeah.
But the information is there, and I think it's really invaluable to have that analysis and Herman's analysis from yesterday with the beef cattle. There's no way that I could get a beef experiment the way Herman did it yesterday. I just wouldn't get the resources, and I wouldn't get the support and people. It just wouldn't happen here. So I think it's just invaluable to have that beef cattle data available, and it certainly encourages me to continue to talk to our beef farmers. I've got a number of them that are, you know, some of them get scared, and you just got to keep talking to them and saying, yeah, you're going to lose a few, but the rewards are just so potentially so great that they should move on. I'm conscious of the time because I've got to go in 5 minutes, but I just wanted to very quickly highlight our grazing experiment that we showed you guys when you were here in Argentina is finished. So that when you were here in New Zealand, so the FT2, FT5, FT10 is wound up. That's been ploughed under. We've started a new experiment. I've got a new PhD student just started who's going to look at lucerne and phosphorus. So that's the only other area that we haven't really worked on. And we're doing that because we've got some funding for a regenerative agriculture experiment, a farmlet study. So I'm comparing a monoculture of lucerne on high and low P soils with a multi-species mix on high and low fertility soils, and we'll see how that does. But so I've got nothing else to add. If anyone's got any comments or questions for either myself or Jose, I'm happy to take those. I guess for those that are continuing to work on modelling, our data is available, Anna. If we can help you at any stage, we're more than happy to make that available. You can get Shumei's email address, etc. if you need to do things. From our perspective, from a modelling perspective, I'm waiting for another student to turn up, hoping that they'll continue. We've done a little bit of modelling. Frank's not with us today, but he did some modelling on trying to adapt the model for dealing with moisture stress. And he's a really good data scientist. So he took an approach of saying, well, the experts can make it work, but can I do it through an optimization process, and ran a whole lot of simulation runs. And he's just finished his master's. So I didn't get him to present because he's just in that final phase of getting that done. But otherwise, that's all we've got. And I appreciate your attendance. I appreciate the interest. And I hope people found it of use. I certainly did. And it was great to see some faces again from my visits to Argentina, and hopefully I'll be able to get back at some stage. And David, I know that I've promised to come to the US at some point. It's still on the cards. It's just at the moment, we're not allowed to even travel to the North Island.
You're very welcome anytime.
All right. So has anyone got any other questions or comments I'd like to make for Jose or myself?
Just a question about the yield prediction, that application that you have, has that been tested outside of Argentina?
Herman, I believe not, but it was calibrated for Argentina.
Because that looks very interesting. It would be a powerful tool. It's another way of estimating seasonal yield.
We can try it.
Yeah, I think there's some opportunity because Anna also just did it, you know, the simple model that Edmar was talking about. We simply ran a thermal time model with a spring and an autumn thermal time response and a response that changed at flowering. That with the soil water budget actually gave us reasonable yield estimates as well. So I think we, you know, the APSIM type modeling is required for asking more difficult questions around catchments and nutrient flows and those things. But application is for farmers, hey, look, we're within plus or minus 15%. We're in there where, you know, that's pretty good.
Is yes, the model is a model, but Lucerne is a very simple. If it is well nodulated, it's a very simple plant. It's nitrogen, radiation, temperature, and water. No.
Yeah, we don't have to worry about nitrogen. We just really have to have a soil water budget and the temperature responses. But
yes.
Please, Herman, don't tell people it's a simple plant. I've spent my whole life saying them it's complicated.
Oh, well, it's my British humor.
You build a career out of a simple plant.
Well, I agree. I mean, I make the same comment with all the legumes. You know, most people think they're short of, they think they're short of water, but they're short of nitrogen. And our legumes deal with that issue. You know, the N comes into the system. You've got as much water as you've got. That's it. It's either rain fed or it's irrigated. What you need is N in the system. And how are you going to get it? Are you going to put it out of a bag or are you going to put it out of a legume? And that's the beauty of alfalfa. My students will be waiting across the other side of campus, so I'm going to have to go. But I thank you all for attending and being enthusiastic and showing interest in our work. And it's been great to hear from the work in South America. We look forward to hearing what's happening in North America shortly, Anna. Okay, thank you.